Under the bright lights of Nashville, they looked like untouchable legends. Their voices shaped country music history, filled arenas, and inspired millions of fans across generations. But behind the applause and standing ovations, many of these stars were fighting private battles that slowly consumed them night after night. Alcohol became their escape, their comfort, and eventually their downfall. In tonight's video, we look back at 8 country music geniuses whose extraordinary talent was slowly buried beneath addiction, loneliness, and heartbreak. 1. George Glenn Jones. Long before the nickname No-Show Jones followed him across America, George Glenn Jones was simply considered one of the greatest voices country music had ever heard. His voice carried pain in a way few singers could imitate. Every note sounded lived in, as if heartbreak itself had climbed onto the stage beside him. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, he was already becoming a legend inside Nashville. But while fans saw greatness under the spotlight, people close to him saw a man slowly disappearing into alcohol night after night. George's drinking became impossible to control. Concert promoters often waited nervously backstage, unsure whether he would even arrive. Some nights he showed up so intoxicated he could barely remember lyrics to songs audiences had paid to hear. Other nights he vanished completely before performances, leaving furious crowds and devastated band members behind. His marriage to Tammy Wynette became filled with chaos, emotional fights, and painful public moments tied directly to his addictions. What made the tragedy even sadder was that George Jones never lost his raw musical brilliance. Even during his darkest years, he could still step before a microphone and deliver performances powerful enough to silence entire rooms. Songs like The Grand Tour and He Stopped Loving Her Today sounded almost unbearably real. Because audiences knew he was singing from a broken life, he could no longer fully escape. For many country fans, George Jones became more than a legend. He became the heartbreaking image of a genius slowly burying himself beneath the bottle, while the whole world watched helplessly. Habsh 2. Hiram Hank Williams. Before modern country music truly found its identity, Hiram Hank Williams had already changed it forever. His songs sounded raw, lonely, and painfully honest in a way audiences had never heard before. Hits like Your Cheatin' Heart, Cold, Cold Heart, and I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry turned him into one of the biggest stars in America while he was still incredibly young. But behind the fame stood a man carrying constant physical pain, emotional exhaustion, and an addiction that slowly consumed the very talent that made him immortal. Hank suffered from severe back problems for much of his life, and the pain pushed him toward alcohol and prescription drugs at an early age. What began as temporary relief slowly became a destructive routine that followed him everywhere. By the early 1950s, his behavior had become wildly unpredictable. He missed rehearsals, arrived drunk to performances, and sometimes collapsed entirely before taking the stage. Members of the Grand Ole Opry eventually grew tired of the chaos surrounding him, and one of country music's brightest stars was dismissed from the very institution he helped elevate. Yet even during his darkest moments, Hank Williams possessed a songwriting gift almost impossible to explain. His voice carried the sadness of ordinary people struggling through heartbreak, loneliness, and regret. Fans heard authenticity in every lyric because Hank himself seemed trapped inside the pain he was singing about. On New Year's Day in 1953, at only 29 years old, Hank Williams died in the backseat of a car while traveling to another concert. Country music lost a genius before he ever had the chance to grow old, and for decades afterward, many fans wondered how much more beauty he could have created if alcohol and addiction had not slowly destroyed him first. Jackie Keith Whitley. When Jackie Keith Whitley stepped into the world of country music, many believed they were hearing the future of Nashville itself. His voice was smooth, emotional, and hauntingly sincere. Unlike louder entertainers of the era, Keith sang with quiet vulnerability, making heartbreak sound deeply personal. By the late 1980s, songs like Don't Close Your Eyes, When You Say Nothing at All, and I'm No Stranger to the Rain transformed him into one of the fastest rising stars in country music. But while his career soared, alcohol was silently tightening its grip behind the scenes. Friends and fellow musicians later admitted that drinking had followed Keith for years, long before mainstream fame arrived. Life on the road only made things worse. Late-night bars, endless touring, and emotional pressure became part of his daily routine. At first, many around him dismissed the drinking as normal country music culture, but eventually, the warning signs became impossible to ignore. Some nights, Keith appeared distant and exhausted before performances, struggling to hide how deeply dependent he had become on alcohol. What made his story especially heartbreaking was how much hope surrounded him during his final years. He had married Lori Morgan, become a father figure, and was finally reaching the commercial success he had dreamed about for years. Many believed he was standing at the beginning of an extraordinary career that could last decades. Then, in 1989, everything suddenly ended. Keith Whitley died from alcohol poisoning at only 33 years old. Nashville was left stunned. Fans mourned not only the man they lost, but the future they would never get to hear. Even today, many country fans still believe Keith Whitley was one of the greatest talents ever, taken too soon by the bottle. Number 4. Donald Eugene Lytle, Johnny Paycheck. Few men in country music lived as dangerously as Donald Eugene Lytle, better known to the world as Johnny Paycheck. With his sharp voice, rebellious image, and outlaw attitude, he became one of the defining faces of hard-living country music during the 1970s. Songs like Take This Job and Shove It turned him into a working-class hero almost overnight. But away from the spotlight, Johnny's life was collapsing under endless drinking, violence, and chaos that slowly buried one of Nashville's most unforgettable talents. Long before fame arrived, Paycheck had already built a reputation for heavy alcohol use and unpredictable behavior. Success only intensified it. Bars, backstage fights, and all-night drinking became part of his everyday existence. Some nights he delivered electrifying performances that left crowds roaring. Other nights, he stumbled through shows barely able to control himself. Fellow musicians often described him as brilliant, but impossible to manage once alcohol took over. As the years passed, the darkness surrounding Johnny Paycheck became impossible to separate from his career. Financial troubles piled up, relationships deteriorated. Then came the incident that shocked country music entirely, a shooting at a bar in Ohio that eventually sent him to prison. By then, many fans barely recognized the man who once seemed destined to become one of the genre's lasting giants. Yet despite everything, Johnny Paycheck's voice never lost its raw power. There was something painfully authentic in the way he sang about frustration, loneliness, and broken pride. Audiences could hear the damage inside him every time he stepped before a microphone. For many country fans, Johnny Paycheck became the ultimate outlaw tragedy. A gifted artist whose incredible talent was slowly swallowed by alcohol, anger, and a life spinning dangerously out of control. Number 5. David Allan Coe. Among the wildest figures country music ever produced, few carried an aura as mysterious and self-destructive as David Allan Coe. With his long hair, outlaw image, and brutally honest songwriting, Coe became a symbol of rebellion during the rise of outlaw country in the 1970s. Songs like You Never Even Called Me by My Name made him unforgettable to fans who admired artists living outside Nashville's polished image. But behind the humor and outlaw mythology stood a man drowning deeper into alcohol, isolation, and emotional chaos with every passing year. David Allan Coe built much of his identity around living recklessly. Stories about endless drinking, biker culture, prison years, and dangerous behavior followed him everywhere he went. Some tales became exaggerated legends, but the damage alcohol caused in his personal life was very real. Friends and musicians often described long nights where Coe drank heavily before performances, disappearing into moods that shifted unpredictably between charm and anger. Unlike many country stars trying to hide their darkness, Coe almost embraced it publicly. His concerts sometimes felt less like polished performances and more like glimpses into a man fighting internal battles in real time. That unpredictability fascinated fans, but it also slowly trapped him inside the very outlaw persona that made him famous. What made Coe's downfall especially tragic was his songwriting brilliance. Beneath the controversy and chaos was a deeply gifted writer capable of exposing pain, loneliness, and bitterness with frightening honesty. Many artists in Nashville quietly admitted his talent was far greater than the public often realized. Over time, alcohol and years of destructive living overshadowed much of his artistry. Instead of being remembered only for his genius, David Allan Coe became another haunting example of a country music legend whose personal demons slowly consumed the life behind the songs. 6. Melinda Gail McCready, Mindy McCready. When Melinda Gail McCready, known to the world as Mindy McCready, first appeared in Nashville during the 1990s, many believed country music had found its next major female star. She was young, beautiful, emotionally vulnerable, and possessed a voice filled with both strength and sadness. Songs like Guys Do It All the Time quickly pushed her into the spotlight, and for a brief moment, Mindy seemed destined for a long and successful career. But behind the fame, loneliness, and addiction were already beginning to consume her private life. Unlike many country legends who hid their pain carefully, Mindy's struggles slowly unfolded in public view. Alcohol became one part of a much larger emotional collapse, involving toxic relationships, depression, legal troubles, and intense media attention. Tabloids followed her relentlessly through arrests, rehab stays, and personal breakdowns that played out in front of millions of people. What made her story especially tragic was how often she appeared to be searching desperately for stability. Friends described moments where Mindy seemed hopeful and determined to rebuild her life, only to fall back into destructive cycles again. The pressure of fame, combined with emotional trauma and addiction, slowly eroded both her career and her sense of peace. Yet through all the chaos, many fans never stopped recognizing her extraordinary vocal talent. There was a raw, emotional honesty in Mindy McCready's voice that made even simple lyrics feel painfully real. She sang like someone carrying invisible wounds no audience could fully understand. By the end of her life, much of the public focused more on her scandals than her music. But for longtime country fans, Mindy McCready remains one of the saddest examples of a gifted artist whose talent was slowly buried beneath alcohol, heartbreak, and overwhelming personal pain. 7. Billy Joe Shaver. Billy Joe Shaver was never just a country singer. He was a storyteller shaped by hardship, faith, and a life spent on the edge of survival. As one of the most respected songwriters in outlaw country, he created music that felt raw, spiritual, and brutally honest. Songs like Live Forever and Old Five and Dimers Like Me carried a depth that made other artists stop and listen. Yet behind this brilliance was a life marked by struggle, heavy drinking, and years of personal instability that constantly threatened to pull him under. Shaver's early life was already defined by pain and survival. He worked tough jobs, faced poverty, and endured constant setbacks long before fame arrived. When success finally came through songwriting, it didn't erase his habits. It often amplified them. Alcohol became part of his identity in the outlaw country scene, where hard living was almost expected. But for Shaver, it wasn't just lifestyle. It was a coping mechanism for everything he had lived through. Throughout his career, there were periods where his talent shone brighter than ever. Artists like Waylon Jennings helped bring his songs to massive audiences, proving just how powerful his writing truly was. Still, behind the recognition, Shaver often struggled with instability, health problems, and long battles with alcohol that affected both his career momentum and personal relationships. What makes his story particularly tragic is that even at his lowest points, Billy Joe Shaver could still write songs filled with clarity and emotional truth. It was as if the chaos around him could not fully silence the voice inside his music. In the end, Shaver became a symbol of contradiction, an artist capable of writing some of country music's most profound lyrics while simultaneously fighting the very demons that made his life so unpredictable. 8. John Melvin Street, Mel Street. John Melvin Street, known to the country world as Mel Street, began his journey far from the glamour of Nashville, in the quiet working-class corners of West Virginia. His voice carried a soft, emotional quality that made listeners feel as if he was singing directly from his own memories. By the early 1970s, songs like Borrowed Angel and If I Had a Cheatin' Heart turned him into a respected name in traditional country music. For a moment, it seemed Mel Street had finally stepped into the kind of success that could last a lifetime. But behind the growing recognition, his personal life was becoming increasingly fragile. The pressures of the music industry, combined with deep emotional struggles, slowly pushed him toward alcohol as a form of escape. What began as occasional drinking gradually turned into a daily dependency. Friends and colleagues noticed changes, missed performances, emotional instability, and a quiet sadness that seemed to follow him even during moments of success. Despite his talent, Mel Street never fully escaped the weight of his inner battles. The more his career demanded consistency, the more unstable his personal life became. Alcohol did not just affect his performances, it deepened his sense of isolation and emotional exhaustion. The contrast between his gentle voice on stage and his private struggles became harder to hide as time went on. In 1978, Mel Street's life came to a tragic end when he took his own life at just 36 years old. His death shocked Nashville and left fans mourning a singer who had never been given enough time to fully realize his potential. Today, he is remembered as a quiet but powerful voice in country music history, another gifted artist whose brilliance was slowly overshadowed by alcohol and inner pain.